Welcome to another edition of No Labels Talks. I'm Holly Page, co-founder of No Labels, here with, are you ready for it, Ryan? Because I've been doing my research. I've got to get a whole new bunch of ways to explain how important you are to this whole thing. So I came up with Swami.
Oh,
What do you
okay.
think?
I think you have a thesaurus in front of you, kind of like going down the list of
I
adjectives.
know Swami's not quite it because it kind of connotates like a little flaky. So really, a sage is the word I'm going to
I
use.
would take
Sage
Swami.
of the
I, when
future
I
of American politics.
when I think Swami, I think kind of like can see the future. I think Zoltar, the guy
Exactly.
who makes Tom Hanks big and big.
Yep.
I think he's
Yeah,
probably like a Swami.
exactly. Anyway, so Ryan, we are 12 days away from being done with this torturous presidential election. And I know everywhere I go and everyone I talk to, we will collectively just be so relieved when it's over, even though it could get a little rocky, but at least we'll know.
I'm jealous of you know, in Europe, I mean, some countries they only have 6 weeks of campaigns. That wouldn't be so good for political consultants. But man, seems like it has been going on forever.
It absolutely does. Even though Vice President Harris has really only been in the race for a relatively short time compared to normal presidential cycles. But yes, I feel like everything has been said, every insult, every whatever has been discussed, except for, of course, the really important stuff.
Yes. So that's right. So here we are. This interminable campaign has gone on forever, and we've already had so many different cycles. And yet, with 12 days left, I mean, I think it's fair to say foreign policy and defense, which in retrospect might be the most important thing for the next 4 years, it just hasn't really been a part of the discussion.
Exactly. I think it ties into how I like to think about No Labels, which is we are one of the very few organizations without a specific agenda, without a specific kind of issue that we are a single issue that we're advocating for, who really are focused on the process of governing.
Yeah.
Our real work starts the day after the election. And I like to think about it that, there's so much energy and money and time spent on the election, which is like the wedding, and no thought whatsoever about the marriage, which, of course, as you and I both know, is where all the rewards are and all the work.
Yeah. No. And well, obviously, the people in Congress long ago needed some counseling. We try to do that from time to time at No Labels. But look, it's always important to find some space for these leaders to work together, but even more so after this election, because the person we have on the podcast today, he is, you know, used to lead our military operations in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. Very few people who know more about the global security environment than this person, and he's really scared. Like a lot of other people, he agreed this is the worst global security environment since World War II in terms of the dangers out there. And if we have another foreign policy crisis tomorrow, we're going to need in very quick order some group of leaders that are willing to stop the nonsense that passes for our politics on most days and actually focus on existential things.
Absolutely. I mean, you can already feel both sides getting ready to continue the war, no matter who wins. And luckily, though, we know allies of ours are already trying to, build the bridge across the party so that, as one of our Senate allies said, a phone call can solve a lot of things. So at least they can make a phone call to one another and work through whatever issues might come up, or try to anyway.
Yeah. Well, our guest that we're speaking to is General Joseph Votel, who is our CENTCOM commander, 40-year decorated career, in the Army, just so thoughtful about the challenges facing our country. And, we got into at a couple different points, some of the ways in which our domestic dysfunction is creating, problems from a security perspective. Like, people will hear this if they listen to the full conversation, but when I was asking him about, the things he'd advise the next president to really get a handle on to protect our security, he brought up the debt, which of course has been the subject of our last 3 or 4 no labels talks. And he's not the first military leader to say this.
Absolutely. And I agree. He was so thoughtful and interesting. And the one thing that kind of calms my nerves as I come up with all kinds of nightmare scenarios of what could happen in the future is we have done a magnificent job as a nation independently educating our officer ranks in the military. They really really are thoughtful and smart and educated outside of the Army or the military services kind of confines. And I think it's going to serve us very well going forward.
Yeah, agreed. And I would hope that, whoever the next president is, I hope they listen to and take some counsel from the speaker we're going to have on the call today, because he's a patriot, and he's got a really smart and insightful view on the threats that are out there and how we can counter them. So let's get right to it. General Joe Votel, this week's edition of No Labels Talks. Hi there, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, with another edition of No Labels Talks. And with us today, in this moment where we have such a perilous global security environment, we have somebody who spent 4 decades on the front lines defending this country, has good a perspective as any on what it takes to keep this country safe. General Joe Votel. General, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Ryan. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Let me just tell you all a little bit about the general's background, and then we'll get right to the questions. He's a retired U.S. Army 4-star, and was the former commander of U.S. Central Command, meaning he was responsible for U.S. and coalition military operations in the Middle East, Central, and South Asia. He served for 4 decades and has since become very active in nonprofit, philanthropic work. He went on to serve as the president and CEO of Business Executives for National Security, which is a network of business leaders trying to keep the country safe. But General, I want to start here. The person who is filling the role of CENTCOM commander now, as they're looking out at the region that they oversee, what right now are they focused on? What are they most concerned about?
Yeah, thanks. And again, it's great to be with you, Ryan, and with the No Labels group here, and really appreciate the work that the organization does. So, I think our current CENTCOM commander is obviously very, very focused on the near-term priorities, which are trying to stabilize what is a situation that it has the possibility of growing out of control even more than it already is. And so his focus is much more oriented towards addressing the near-in issues of perhaps defending Israel, of addressing problems down in the lower Red Sea, about preventing the expansion of conflict more widely across the region, and reassuring our partners in the region that the United States is present and is working to address the stability across the region. So I think he's really very focused on kind of the here and now.
General, I want to ask you, do you think the United States and Israel right now, and of course Israel, one of our closest historic allies, but are we pursuing the same goals in the region? Because look, it was very clear after October 7th that we were standing with the Israelis in their right to defend themselves. Of course, in the last month or two, Israel has had a string of notable military and intelligence successes against the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah. In the wake of the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, the Americans' positions seems to be, this is the moment where we should really move to close up this conflict, bring the hostages home, get a ceasefire. It isn't clear that that is the Israeli strategy as well. Are we working towards the same set of strategic goals here, or is there a divergence?
I think there most definitely is a divergence. And, I think as you perhaps look at our military to military relationship, I think you see a lot of unity there. Certain our CENTCOM commander who talks with his counterpart I think, has pretty good collaboration and pretty good alignment around military things. But I think where we do diverge is in our strategic objectives. Most of our narrative, most of our discussion, most of our advice certainly over the last several months, and really for the majority of this last year, has really been about preventing the spread of the conflict, moving it towards a true regional conflict, and trying to get out of war fighting and get back into negotiations and trying to create ceasefires. That's been where the United States has largely been oriented. Where Israel has largely been oriented is in defending themselves, I think, and addressing the situation that emerged on October 7th, down in Gaza, but which now is clearly spread up into Hezbollah, and of course is coming at them from a variety of other directions, and they are I think necessarily focused on that, but there is a divergence between what the Israelis are focused on, what the United States is focused on. And I think this really highlights, I think, one of the real challenges of the Middle East right now. And I think as we move forward, it's going to be really important for us to reconceive some of the assumptions that we've had about the Middle East for a long period of time. For example, I'll give you two examples. One example is we've for a long time, the assumption is the power of Hezbollah could act as an effective deterrent against Israel. That's been Iran's proposition in this. And that clearly has been demonstrated to be false over the last several weeks as Israel, as you pointed out, has gone after them in a very devastating way, of removing leadership, undermining their communications, going after their missile storage sites, everything else. And now, just as we've seen the last couple of days, going after some of the financial means that support that organization. So I've been very confident. So that whole assumption now really has to be rethought of certainly on the Iranian side, but so that's one of them. Another assumption I think that has to be rethought right now is U.S. influence in the region. I think certainly I think we are respected across the region, but I think what we've seen that our advice has not necessarily been taken. Certainly by the Netanyahu government, they are clearly pursuing objectives that they view of higher priority to themselves than the longer term, I think, more strategic, more regionally oriented objectives we have. So, I mean, I think it's an incredibly unique time in the region right now. And to underscore your question, I do think we are diverging between the United States and Israel right now, certainly at the strategic level.
General, there seems to be one of the big differences in terms of the foreign policy of maybe the Biden and Obama administration, the Trump administration, and we talk about assumptions, is the assumption about the extent to which you can work with and negotiate with the Iranians. Obviously, the Biden and Obama administration tried at different points and successfully at one point did a nuclear deal with them. What do you think of that set of assumptions? Do you think there is any way to come to an accommodation with the current regime of Iran? Or does it just have to continually be marginalized and diminished? Should that be the goal of the United States?
Well, I mean, I always think as a soldier, I always think you have to figure out ways to communicate with your adversaries and try to work through things. I mean, this was a feature of the Cold War, even despite all the buildup and everything else that went along with that. We still maintain communication channels with the then Soviet Union, and our leaders talked, and we had ways of communicating back and forth with them. I think it's really dangerous when we don't have ways of doing that. So I think I mean, my personal view is I do favor us trying to figure out how we develop relationships. I think our challenge is that we've kind of whipsawed back and forth across the strategic spectrum here for a number of years. I mean, we obviously had the effort with the JCPOA, which resulted in an agreement that by all accounts, at least my assessment at the time as a CENTCOM commander, that Iran was adhering to, and that was being confirmed by the international community. And of course, we stepped back from that, and then we tried to restart it again. So we've had, I think, a really challenged strategic approach to Iran that, unlike the Cold War, where we had continuity through our strategy, we lack continuity in this particular case. And I think that's really important. And I think the task for whatever administration comes in now will be to not only look at how we militarily address Iran, but how we also look at the political and diplomatic approach to them, and how we develop a strategic approach in those particular areas. We have to shift our focus more towards this in the diplomatic area, and we have to be working more and more with our partners in the region to prevent them from being vulnerable to kind of the Iranian approach in the region, which has been to develop these proxies, to support them, to use them to do their bidding, and it's really resulted in extraordinary instability across the region. So, yeah, we need to have a more sustainable, continuous strategy towards Iran that will ultimately put us into a position where we actually can have some type of dialogue with them about their role in the region and our interests in the region. I think it's important.
General, one area of where there was a little bit of continuity between the last couple of administrations is the desire to create some normalization between Israel and the Gulf states, which of course the Trump administration did with the Abraham Accords. And then of course the next goal would be to do something analogous with Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would kind of represent the grand bargain for the region. Some people viewed Hamas's attack on Israel in October 7th, at least in part, as a way for them to interfere with the movement towards that normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Do you think that is still a possible endgame here that the United States and Israel could move towards?
I do. I mean, I think clearly Hamas's efforts on October 7th, I mean, a major part of that was to disrupt that. I think they could see the writing on the wall and what that might mean for them and for the broader Iranian axis of resistance. And I think there's very, very clear evidence that was the case. But I think our government has worked pretty hard to try to preserve the opportunity for this to come together. And I think that both Israel and Saudi Arabia recognize the value of an agreement, under the Abraham Accords sometime in the future, and what that would mean to the two countries. For us, for the United States, I think it would really be critical. I mean, the value of the Abraham Accords is that in normalizing this, it's also made it a lot easier to bring people together around common challenges in the region. Of course, one of the big challenges, of course, is Iran. So perhaps one of the most effective things we could do against Iran, from purely a diplomatic political standpoint, is to build a very strong coalition of nations who are aligned among themselves, and then aligned against what Iran is trying to do in the region. So yeah, I don't think the opportunity has passed us. It certainly has been delayed, and it'll take some work to get it back on the track. But I think it's still very much in our interest. And I think it's in the interest of Israel and Saudi Arabia.
General, I want to ask you, broadening out a little bit, about something that was a really significant focus of yours when you were CENTCOM commander, where you led the efforts to get ISIS, to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. How is that fight going? Because of course, justifiably, there's been all this attention on Israel, on Iran, on Hezbollah. Of course, Iran is a Shia theocratic regime, but the Sunni fundamentalists like ISIS, Al Qaeda, of course, its forebearer, remain a threat to us. How is that fight going right now in your view?
You know, with in the early spring of 2019, when we actually completed the destruction of the physical caliphate, that is their ability to actually control large amounts of terrain and impose their will on people in as kind of a quasi government. That's been gone now since then and has not returned. But in both of those countries, both in Iraq and in Syria, there are remnants of ISIS that are still present. This is in Iraq. I think it's probably around 1,000 people that have kind of gone to the desert. About the same number in Syria that have gone into the so-called Badia, kind of the central government desert area of Syria, and have begun to emerge from there and launch attacks. The United States has kept forces in both Iraq and Syria in much smaller numbers than we had. We're probably about 2,500 or so in Iraq and about 500-ish in Syria. But that has been enough for us to continue to work with our two partners, the Iraqi security forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces, to keep pressure on that. So that aspect of it has been going good, and we've been able to continue to keep pressure on that network. But there are some challenges here. In Syria, for example, we still have anywhere from 40 to 50,000 civilians, family members of ISIS fighters that are in camps, and being kept in those locations. And these are hotbeds for radicalization, and they've now been there for 6 or 7 years. So this is a problem, and this is potentially something we'll have to deal with down the line. Likewise, a number of the fighters of ISIS that we captured at the end of this are in detention facilities in Syria, and we're in the process of moving those back to the countries that they came from. But that's been a very, very slow process. So you also have, excuse me, you also have kind of an ISIS in detention, if you will, that is waiting to get to be let out of this, and they're fighting hard to get out of these prisons. They launched a prison break about a year ago. About 1,000 of them got out. It took several weeks to police all that up and get them back into it. The Syrian Democratic Forces, with our help, were able to do that. But I mean, it's still a precarious position, even though we are able to maintain good partnerships with our two principal partners on the ground. I think the other important point to preach about this is our government has announced, along with the Iraqi government, that we will bring this operation to a conclusion by the end of 2026. I personally have some concerns about this. I do think we have to think through this very, very clearly and make sure that we are leaving enough stuff here and to continue to support our operations in Syria. And we need to think about our relationships with the Kurds. It's been a long established relationship for a long period of time. We need to think about what this means across the region. So yeah, that's still very present. We don't talk about it very much, but it's still very much one of the things we're focused on in the Middle East.
General, you've talked before about when you led CENTCOM, you also had issues with attacks from the Houthis, which of course are a designated terrorist group, or were at least, in Yemen. They now, of course, have been launching drones and missiles into the Red Sea and making it impossible for global shipping to go through there. What is it that we need to be doing that we aren't to reopen commercial navigation through that area of the world?
Well, I think most important is we need a much more comprehensive approach to the Houthi challenge. The United States Navy is doing fantastic work down there defending, the ships that go, the remaining ships that do go through there, clearly defending themselves. We're doing strikes against some of the obvious locations where the Houthis are operating. We brought some B-2s in last week to go after some of the storage locations for some of their more advanced technology and weaponry. But like we see in most of these situations is the military can do a lot, but it can't do everything, and it really can't solve the problem. So we have to have a much more comprehensive approach, diplomatically, economically, informationally, to address this. We have to put more pressure on Iran. Because they are the principal suppliers of this. We need a greater diplomatic outreach to the nations in the region. It would surprise most Americans, I think, to appreciate that the only Gulf nation that is involved in our efforts to combat the Houthis is Bahrain. So Saudi Arabia, Egypt, who really have the most at stake here, really are not and have not showed up for the game yet on this. They're not contributing many resources. 50% of the revenues through the Suez Canal, have dropped. It's dropped 50% over the last year. You would think that Egypt would see it in their interest to get involved and help us address this. So we need a much more comprehensive approach to the Houthis. We need to be willing to go in and be a bit more aggressive with our military, but at the same time, we need to make sure we're leveraging all the other elements of power in a much more complete approach to the problem. The fact that one of our principal interests in the Middle East, that is the free flow of commerce, has now been stopped by this group, the Houthis, I think is astounding, and I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our partners in the region, I think, to do everything we can with our partners to reopen that free flow of commerce. I mean, this is still where 30% of world goods go through every day. It's a critically important area.
General, if we move further east, we are now coming up on 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. And one of the things that's striking is if you listen to the respective presidential candidates talk about this, you've heard former President Trump say, "I will end this conflict in 24 hours." It's not clear exactly how we do this. For her part, Vice President Harris says, "I will be with Ukraine for as long as it takes." What I don't think is clear from either candidate is what the end game should be for the United States. And of course, that's not entirely our choice to make. But in your view, what does a successful outcome look like for the United States as it relates to Ukraine? What should we be driving towards?
Well, I mean, the focus of our efforts clearly has been on trying to, give Ukraine everything that it needs to repel the Russian military and restore the sovereignty of Ukraine. So I think that's where we've kind of been focused on it. I think the pragmatic aspect of this is when you look at the current situation, what we find ourselves in is a largely attritional warfare right now, with well-established lines and incremental changes that take place along the so-called Eastern Front here in the Donbass area and some of the areas in the east there. And it's not changing very much. I would say the momentum is probably with the Russians. They are able to apply a little bit more pressure there and make some incremental changes along there. But for the most part, this is pretty much a stalemate, and it's become largely attritional. So what you see missiles and drones going back and forth between each side, trying to attrit their capabilities. And this, I think, pragmatically, I think we have to recognize that. So I think what we should be focusing on right now is trying to create the most favorable conditions we can for Ukraine to be at. So when we actually do get to a place where we can negotiate, then they are in a position to negotiate from a position of strength with the backing of not just the United States, but the backing of NATO, and be able to reassert some of their claims. Whether that will mean they get all the territory back, I don't know. That's going to be very difficult to do without expelling them. There's no incentive, certainly on the Russian side right now, to give anything up. And of course, they've really normalized a lot of these areas and made them look very Russian as well. So it will be very, very difficult to get that back. But I think what our focus has been in is trying to put the Ukrainians in the very best position. I think, frankly, and again, pragmatic, we have to look at how long the American people are going to be willing to put up with this. I mean, I think everyone can appreciate the fact that that this has been a vicious assault on Ukraine, but you know, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of other things that are going in that direction, and you know, I think American citizens will begin to wonder what the end state is as well. So it's imperative for us to move forward and help Ukraine create this position where we can get to some negotiations here down the line.
So, General, if you were advising the next president, whoever it is, and of course we are coming up on earlier this year, Congress approved an aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Some big chunk of that might expire by early to mid next year. What would you be telling a new president if you were advising them on what we should be doing as it relates to Ukraine?
I think we need to decide if we're all in on this, and if we're not, then we need to revise our strategy. So we've now been debating, I think, in our government, you know, our willingness to allow Ukraine to use the weapons that we provide them in the manner that they see fit. We've been very concerned, I would say initially, rightfully so, here with provoking Russia. I think what we found over the course of this is that that some of our concerns about this may not have come true, and so I think we have to decide whether we're going to allow them to do the things that they need to do with this, or if not, then we need to look at revising our strategy. So I guess what I would advise, you know, a new administration is, hey, let's figure out what our strategy is. Let's figure out what our end goal is, and then let's get on the path of moving towards it. I think that's going to be really, really critical for us.
Before we get to questions, General, I want to just talk about the United States military in particular. There was recently a commission on the National Defense Strategy, which was a independent panel that was put together by Congress to take a look at the United States defense posture and capabilities. Among its conclusions, it said, number one, that the threats we're facing right now as a country are the most serious we've faced since at least 1945. But the other more bracing conclusion is it said it wasn't clear if we had to go to war now that we would be prepared to win. And so one, I'm curious if you agree with that assessment. And two, again, if you could put your hat back on, where if you were advising the next president on the most important steps that they can make to revitalize the military, what would those be?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that should be addressed. I would not just limit it to the new administration. I mean, I think it's very important for the new Congress as well. As you know, no enemy has done more damage to the United States military than this really convoluted budgeting process we've had that's kept us in continuing resolutions for a large part of every budget year, has prevented us from moving out on new programs that we need, and has, I think, really limited our buying power across the Department of Defense. So we need to get aligned here between the administration and Congress, and certainly the Pentagon here, and make sure that our military has the resources at the time that it needs. I mean, the budgets are big. I get that. I understand that. There's a reason for that. But the way that the that the resources get to our forces, particularly with so many continuing resolutions and so many other workarounds with this, rather than approved budgets, I think really limits our ability to get after the things that our services and our combatant commanders have identified as necessary. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is we have to pay attention to our own industrial base here in the United States. I think the last statistics I saw, for example, and as an example of this, I think China has nearly 2 million square feet of shipbuilding space. We have something over 100,000. So not a lot. We really lack the infrastructure that we need to be able to scale up for the challenges that we are facing. I mean, look at things like artillery rounds. The Army, I think, has done great work over the last couple of years to increase the number of 155 artillery rounds. The principal munition that is being used in Ukraine right now, and we've gone from 15 to 20,000 to a rate of about 50,000 a month, and we're continuing to grow up in that. But it's taken us a couple years to get there. And by the way, we only had one plant that was building these at the beginning, so we've had to look at this. I think the diversification, the expansion, the modernization of our industrial base, I think is absolutely a critical thing. And I don't want to say we're too late, but we really need to get going on this because China is well in advance of us in terms of their manufacturing production capacity, and that should be a real concern for us. I think the third area we have to pay some attention to is certainly in our acquisition and how we buy things and how we bring it in. I mean, I think there's, we have a problem with how we acquire capabilities and equipment for the military. We're still very much focused on things like cost, schedule, performance, and we're not focusing enough on the innovation and leveraging commercial technology to get the things out to our troops that we need. We need to learn from the experience that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, where we're buying equipment in tranches, we're taking things directly out of the commercial market, and we're applying them for national security purposes. And then when we're done with it, we're going to get rid of it, and then we're going to move on to the next thing. We need serious look at this acquisition process, which I think is a real tire around our neck right now as we move forward. And I guess the final thing I would just say on the people side, I know there's been a lot of focus on recruiting here over the last year, and I'm very happy to, that my service, the Army, the one I came from, met their requirements this year, as did most of the service. I think the Navy was the only one that came up a little bit short in this. There's been some great initiatives put in place by the services to address this. And I just know from what the Army has done, I mean, things like soldier referral programs, a program to help improve recruits before they show up at basic training, so they're better prepared, they're more physically fit, they can meet the standards that we have for educational requirements and other things like this. These are important programs, and I think we're doing good with that. And I have confidence the military will continue to move forward in that. We need help from the American public, though. We need more discussion on the value of service the nation in uniform, or service the nation in many other ways. So we need more of a national dialogue on the importance of service, and I think that will help us. I think as we move forward as well.
It's interesting, General. Your friend, our friend, Admiral Dennis Blair, has talked frequently about that first item 4, the way in which Congress budgets or doesn't budget. And he's talked to our community about this before. The reality of you have to buy weapon systems with 5, 10, 15-year time horizons. And if you're funding government at 3-6 month intervals, that makes it impossible to build this thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're singing from the same hymnal here on this. I mean, this is we've got to get past this. This, I think, is a byproduct of some of the polarity that we see in the country right now, that we have a tendency to hold these things at risk, and it just is not. It's not working to our benefit as a nation right now. And given the very serious challenges we have with continued challenge of terrorism, instability in the Middle East, a very aggressive Russia in Eastern Europe, and of course this juggernaut out in the Pacific called China that is moving very, very quickly, and is very quickly outpacing us in many areas where we have traditionally been the leader. So we've got to get serious. We've got to get serious about this.
Thanks, General. It's okay with you. We're going to go to a couple questions.
Sure.
If everybody could just say your name and where you're from. And let's start with George. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, General. And I've actually got a three-part question, but if that's too long and taking up too much time, feel free to grab any one or two sections of that. One is the military's credibility with the public. I think, for someone who's watched it somewhat closely, with the littoral ship fiasco, and I hope I've got that right, but I'm sure you know what I mean, where we built 20-some ships or committed to building 20-some ships, and they were just a disaster. They didn't work. They cost us billions of dollars. And even after we realized that, we continued to build those ships. How do we avoid that in the future? What did we learn from it? That's one. Two questions relating to Israel. Well, one is, given where we're at right now, which is waiting for Israel to respond to Iran's latest attack, would it not make sense to support Israel in taking out Iran's nuclear capabilities? And two, on the other side of that issue, would you have had, or would you have, or has the U.S. military worked with Israel to try and develop a better way to respond to the crisis in Gaza than what it's used for the last year? Because it is extremely hard to justify the number of deaths and the pure destruction that's been done to Gaza. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, George. I appreciate your questions. I'm going to take them in reverse order, if you don't mind here. So I agree with you on this challenge here of the kind of the conduct of the campaign and the need to make sure we look after the people that are left behind in these military operations, and I actually think the United States has certainly made this a key talking point, and I think it's been a constant pressure point for us for almost the entire time. I mean, the fact that the President of the United States went to Israel within 7 days of October 7th. And again, the reported conversation was sharing the benefit of our lessons learned from, our experience in the global war on terrorism, of rushing into things without thinking through the end state of this. I think is perhaps one of the most important things. I'm afraid where we find ourselves right now is kind of in a as a sticker carrot kind of approach here with this. We're going to withhold some stuff. Unless you do this. I mean, we'll see what kind of comes out of this latest message that comes from this. But yes, I think there's been a steady dialogue and communication. The whole effort behind this ship to shore thing that the United States tried to put in the Mediterranean, it didn't work. I got it. It didn't work. But I think it was a valiant effort because we saw this and we were trying to figure out ways that we could help with this. And in the end, it was not an effective way of doing that. So yeah, I think we've clearly got to continue to do that. In terms of going after Iranian nuclear capabilities, I think this has been one of the key target areas that's been looked at. I mean, I think Israel is rightly concerned about allowing their adversaries in the region to return to the status quo. So they've clearly been focused on this. Our ability to go in and do that, I certainly think we could do some damage to the current stuff, but in most cases, it's not going to eliminate the knowledge and other things that they have identified, and it's clearly going to push the regime in an even more radical direction. So I guess I can see I can see the advantages of going after it and taking it off. but I can also see that there are some ramifications here that we would have to deal with down the line on this. In terms of military credibility, I think you're absolutely right on this. And there's certainly, I think you can point to any of our services and point to a program or several that have not been executed in the way that they are. I fundamentally think the problem that we have is a coherent strategy for how we are approaching the security challenges that we have. I think, again, I'm an officer that grew up in the early part of my career in the Cold War. Our ability to articulate our strategy against the Soviet Union, particularly in Europe, led to the development of really great programs like the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Black Hawk helicopter, self-propelled artillery rounds, a whole series of maritime naval capabilities that were developed largely around us meeting that fight. And I think what we fundamentally have is a mismatch between or a lack of connection, I should say, not a mismatch, a lack of connection between the things that we are pursuing and our overall strategy. And I think getting a strategy in place would go a long way towards making sure that we are buying the things that we need down the line.
Thank you for your perspective.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Dorsey.
Hi, I'm Dorsey Cartwright. I'm in Austin, Texas. And my question has to do with North Korea. I've been seeing in the paper and then a lot more today that it looks like that certainly the North Koreans are providing supplies and aid to Russia in their war with Ukraine, but also there's the possibility now that their soldiers are actually fighting in Ukraine. And so I'm wondering what the ramifications of this might be in your eyes.
Yeah, thanks, Dorsey. I think that's a really good question. I think everyone is concerned about this and trying to figure this out. The North Korean leadership for a number of decades now has diverted a large part of the resources they would normally use for their population to their military, to their own development of capabilities, and of course has developed a huge supply of artillery rounds and other things. And so we saw them providing some of this to the Russians because the Russians have expended a lot of their munitions. So they've done that, and they've certainly done that, and that came several months ago. This movement of troops from North Korea, I guess now into Russia, I think is an indication that certainly Russia is feeling the pinch in terms of their own people. In their own ability to get enough troops in there, but it's also, I think, highlights the attritional nature of this fight. That this is really about who has the most and who can continue to apply the most. And clearly, Russia, a bigger country, can do this. And when they get more help from the North Koreans, who have got a large population, a fairly significant population as well, and a lot of men under arms, then they can certainly do this. I think the ramifications are extraordinary here. What happens when U.S.-made munitions kill North Koreans? What does that mean? How does that ratchet up tensions on the Korean Peninsula? What does this mean for other countries coming to aid Russia? Will this be an example of where others can do this? So I think we should be very, very concerned about this. An out of place and out of area deployment by North Korea, for goodness sakes, into Ukraine is about as I don't think I had that anywhere on my bingo card here. So, I mean, it's really unusual, and I think it's going to have some fairly significant ramifications for us and for the region down the line.
Thank you, General.
Thank you.
Bill. Go ahead, Bill.
Good afternoon, General Votel. Bill Kennedy from Fort Collins, Colorado. I want to thank you for being here today to share your views with us. This is really great. And most of all, I want to thank you for your lifetime of patriotism in supporting our freedoms and protecting our national interests. We need more patriots like you. I'm glad that you mentioned Iran as the principal bad actor in the Middle East, and you also pointed out the need for a sustainable strategy that's supported by a better coalition against Iran. I'd be curious to know what actors, countries, or organizations you think we should recruit into such a coalition, and what might be the principal arguments that would lure them in?
Well, I think certainly we have to start with the Gulf countries, and we have to get alignment with all of them. One of the areas in which we've struggled, I think, for a number of years now is in the area of integrated air defense, for example. You know, we very effectively, the United States and a couple of our partners, very effectively working with the Israelis, help defend Israel from these two attacks that have come from Iran. I think it's a good example of what can be done when we bring different parties together. So I think bringing together the Arab Gulf states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the Emirates, and Oman, I think are the ones that I'm principally talking. These are the big actors in the region. They're not all aligned among themselves, but they all have generally had good relationships with us in the past, and they have the most at stake in the region. And so a sustainable strategy, has to consider them as well. I would also add in the next tier of that, of course, Egypt. Egypt, of course, is the entry point to the region for us. They control the strategically critical Suez Canal. So they have to be brought into this as well. Countries like Jordan will be important to this as well. They don't have a lot of capacity, but they have the king. And the king is still a prominent voice across the Middle East, really across the globe. And when you give His Majesty an opportunity to say no, he almost always says yes to us. He's been an extraordinary partner, and his value is just being Jordan, allowing us to base there and do other things. So, you know, you've got to take those partners in. I think looking outside the region, I think certainly the UK is a critical partner of this. They have a lot of history here with this, but there are other European nations that have a lot at stake here as well. And I think at another tier of support would be France and Germany, and I think the Northern European states, who I think bring some really great capability and who are very dependent upon movement of goods and commerce through that part of the region and benefit from it. So they definitely would reap the benefits by a more stable Middle East. So I think, I don't think there's anybody surprising in that particular list of partners there. I think they're the normal ones. There probably are some others that need to be added to it. But there are plenty of people who have interests in the region who can come together around a good strategy for how we collectively protect our interests.
Thanks, Bill. Just have time for a couple more questions. Ian.
Hi, my name's Ian. I'm from Blacksburg, Virginia. My question is about some news that recently came out regarding Afghanistan. So Russia delisted the Taliban as a terrorist organization in their fold. So I'm wondering if you think that Russia and Iran could be trying to add the Taliban into their network of proxies, and if Afghanistan could once again become relevant in the, I guess, the fight for the Middle East and that global dynamic.
Yeah, no, I think Ian, I think you're exactly on it here. I think that's a really critical aspect of it. I think you have to look at Russia's motives are largely driven by pursuing actions that really minimize our influence in the region or on a more global standpoint. So reaching out and throwing a lifeline to the Taliban, could be seen in their interests and certainly in the Taliban's interests. I don't have many concerns about the Taliban, largely beyond Afghanistan or the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region where they're most prominent. I don't know that they necessarily will themselves will be a factor globally, but I am concerned about some of the challenges that the Taliban providing access to organizations like Al Qaeda or ISIS or others like that. Probably not ISIS. They very much oppose ISIS, but to other terrorist organizations to use Afghanistan as a platform from which external attacks can be launched. So I think there's some concern with that. Russia, of course, doesn't have the same commitment to human rights or to other values that we have. So they're much more willing to look away from those types of things and look purely at the more practical aspects of relationships that support their very direct very direct objectives.
Thank you so much for taking a couple minutes with us today.
Glad to be with you, and thanks to all of you for being a part of this this great organization that I've learned so much about over the last couple of years. That is really trying to bridge the divides and look for the common space here among our citizens. It's great work, and it's really critical to the nation. And I'm glad to be talking with you today.
Well, we appreciate that. General Joe Votel, everybody, former CENTCOM commander, real American patriot, and appreciate having him on. Appreciate all of you joining us on No Labels Talks, and look forward to talking to you all again next week. Until then, have a good week.